labor power or union power, the terms are used synonymously, is never very strong in the United States. But to the extent that it ever is strong, that would be when economic times are bad. So the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893, even the Great Depression in the 1930s. That's because people are coming together, strength in numbers, to try to exert leverage over their bosses to try to get, as always, better working conditions, fewer hours, and more money. Now, labor power goes down. That means labor membership goes down. When economic times are good and the owners and the managers are able to say to their workers, why would you ever join unions? Look how good everything is. The first of the three strikes that we're going to look at wasn't, in fact, really a major strike. It was a protest and the consequences of that protest to a minor strike. And so you're going to have a strike at the McCormick Harvester plant in Chicago. Those of you that were the Reaper folk in our antebellum invention roundtable, McCormick Harvester made the Reapers. And so they're going to have a strike at the plant, and the police are going to break it up, and there's complaints about police violence. So there's a call to arms. Everybody who's upset about this, come to Haymarket Square. And so people are talking about police brutality. They're talking about the need for the 8-hour day, which is a constant labor idea. So 8 hours of work, 8 hours of play, 8 hours of sleep. And when the police show up, a bomb is thrown, much like we saw at the Boston Massacre or even the shot heard around the world. Not entirely clear who threw the bomb, but it's not really important who threw the bomb. It's the consequence of the bomb. Bomb goes off, and at that point, essentially, hell breaks loose. Policemen die. People that were there protesting die. And so this really becomes an opportunity for the Chicago law enforcement to round up all of these anarchists. Now, it's not really alleged anarchists, because many of the people that were rounded up were, in fact, self-proclaimed anarchists, many of them German immigrants. And so when these folks get rounded up and are found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, when, in fact, there was little evidence linking them to throwing the bomb at all, you're going to see this idea of labor and the Knights of Labor. That means, generally speaking, union workers and anarchists all thrown together. Now, again, the Knights of Labor were not anarchists. There might have been some people that believed in anarchy, but that was not their main idea. They were the big inclusive union of skilled and unskilled workers, but not anarchists. But in the public perception, you're going to have Knights of Labor, anarchists, bad people, and you're going to see the reputation of the Knights go down. Now, there is sort of a hero in the story, if you will. Not shockingly, his middle name is Peter, but it's the Illinois governor who pardons the 3 surviving anarchists. Others had been killed or had actually killed themselves in prison. But he actually was hurt politically by virtue of the fact that he actually did pardon these supposed. Now, when you look at this political cartoon and you say, what's the message of this cartoon? The assumption in most people's minds is that the bomb throwers were the ones that were out of control. Now, if you look at this cartoon, you'll see, in fact, that the bomb being thrown, much like the police officer up there in the back statue that seems to be shooting at people, that the bomb is law enforcement creating anarchy. It's not, in fact, that the protesters created anarchy. It's that the law enforcement ran roughshod over everyone's civil liberties. And that was a major complaint by immigrants, by union workers, by anarchists at the time. So real anti-authority came out of the way that people were treated as a result of Haymarket Square. Now, on the flip side, when you look at this cartoon, A History of Anarchy in Chicago, and you look at sort of in the top, chapter 1, this dirty radical who's promoting the end of all government, and then as a result of Haymarket, they're all locked up, and then you see, pardon me, that people have been hung, and then the last chapter you see that stability and law and order have reigned. This is the way that many people in Chicago who had something to lose, business owners, upstanding people, looked at the situation and said, good riddance to all of those anarchists they got what they deserved. The second strike we're going to look at is, in fact, a major strike. And in this case, it comes 6 years after Haymarket Square. It happens in Pennsylvania. And it happens at one of Andrew Carnegie, depending on your pronunciation, one of his steel plants. Now, Carnegie himself is not involved. Carnegie's off in Scotland. But he's left it in charge of his manager, who is a very, very powerful man named Henry Clay Frick. Yes, his name is Henry Clay, but not related to the Henry Clay. Now, there is a standoff between the union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the AA, and Frick. Frick didn't want them there, felt like they were, of course, asking for too much in terms of wages. So he's going to try to break this union. And the way he's going to try to break this union is he's going to lock the union out of the plant. Now, what he's going to say is, I don't like you. I'm going to keep you from actually working in the plant, and we'll see. If you really want a job, you'll come back and you'll actually have to admit that your union doesn't work. And he was actually creating essentially like an armed fortress where he could keep people out. Now, what happens is that you're going to get the union that says, well, you're locking us out, so we're actually going to strike. So now you have the union workers not being allowed in, and the union workers standing outside saying, we're not going to let anyone else in. You say, well, why would you do that? Well, they don't want anybody else to come in and cross the picket line, namely scabs who would take their jobs and oftentimes do it for less money and help keep the factory going. Now, you've got the strike going on, and scabs wouldn't be allowed in. So Frick then says, well, I'm going to bring in essentially hired muscle, the Pinkertons, to make sure to keep those strikers away so I can get workers into the plant. Well, the Pinkers arrive on scene, and they get shot at by the strikers who are waiting for them, and you're going to have major violence. Now, what we want to pay attention to is, in most situations that you have where there's a labor management struggle, the government, in some cases the city government, as was the case in Haymarket, or the state government, as is in the case at Homestead, or even the federal government, it's going to be the case at Pullman, they come in to try to create order. And so the state militia comes in, and the company itself is going to bring in strike breakers, people that are going to cross the picket line and keep the factory going. The city of Homestead is put under martial law by these state troops. That means that actually the government is running the city at this point to keep safety, and any support or goodwill for the workers goes away. And in the end, you're going to have many people who say, I just can't stay out on the picket line. I need this job. It doesn't look like we're going to get what we want. And so they end up crossing the picket line, and the strike is broken. When you look at this political cartoon, it gets at the heart of why Pullman workers were so upset by what was happening at Pullman in the 1890s. Now, if you see the picture of George Pullman squeezing his workers between low wages and high rents, you need to go back to this idea that during the Panic of 1893, George Pullman reduced the wages of all the people that lived in his company town, which was part of the agreement to work at his facility, yet he kept the rents the same. So in essence, he charged them a certain amount to live in his required town, but did not give them enough to actually live in his town. So this is going to cause the workers to become so upset that they strike. It's important to realize that George Pullman didn't actually make the railroad. He made a specific, or the people in his facility made a specific Palace car which was like a luxury car that went as part of the train. And because they had lower wages, yet their rent stayed the same, and they had to live in his town in order to work for his company, they were very upset and they struck. Okay, and that's where we get on the scene Eugene V. Debs, who's going to be more famous probably for being a socialist who runs for president and loses a number of times. But this is where he really appears on the scene for the first time. And he gets the Pullman workers to be part of the American Railway Union, which together is going to try to make a big public statement that says, we're not going to move any trains because of what is happening to our brothers and sisters who are working on this one part of the train. And so they get over 100,000 workers on many different railroad lines to effectively walk off their job and stop railroad traffic in certain parts of the country, particularly the Midwest. Now, as you can imagine, the people whose trains aren't moving, the railroad executives, are very pissed off. And so they get together and they bring in strike breakers who they hope will actually make the trains move. And anytime you have strike breakers and strikers of huge number, you're likely going to have violence. Okay, so the federal government gets involved, and the federal government attorney general Richard Olney, who in fact had previously been a railroad executive prior to becoming attorney general, got an injunction. And an injunction is something that comes from the government. It says to the people, you have to stop doing something. If you keep doing it, you'll actually be arrested. Now, Eugene V. Debs has got this strike going on, and it's looking pretty bad for the country because the railroads aren't moving. And so President Grover Cleveland gets involved. And in this case, Grover Cleveland is going to say, well, technically we got two issues here. One is that the mail isn't moving. And the federal government had a number of responsibilities, but one of which, going all the way back to the late 1700s, was to deliver the mail. And so what he's going to do is he's going to encourage not only the federal troops, but along with the strike breakers to connect mail cars to these trains that are just sitting there idly and not moving, and therefore there's a legal justification to actually make the trains move. We got to get the mail delivered. On top of that, and with great irony, what you're going to have happen is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had originally been passed to, in theory, help the little guy by eliminating monopolies and in doing so creating more competition, which means that wages could go up and prices could go down. It's actually used to break strikes and break unions, which were seen as anti-competitive restraints on trade, which again is really pretty ironic. So when you have thousands of marshals and thousands of U.S. troops that come in and take action and force these trains to move and suppress these strikers, ultimately you're going to have more violence, but it's going to end up at the end of the day that the Pullman strike is broken. So the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike, and of course the strike-ish elements that had happened at Haymarket all show that the federal government, state government, and even city government tend to come in on the side of private industry against labor unions. I think many of us tend to think about the fact that there are Europeans coming to the United States in the late 1800s, particularly from Southern and Central Europe. But many people forget that a large number of people that were actually coming to the cities were young rural women. And because of the mechanization on the farms, just didn't have the opportunities that it used to have. So whereas families used to work together to get everything done on the farm, now it's increasingly male dominated because women aren't needed as much because machines can do most of the work. So what you're going to have here is not only women that are sort of out of a job, but you have the introduction of new ways to produce what women used to do. So we think about it now with like Sears and Montgomery Ward, both of which are longtime department stores that are now actually in 2016 either out of business or going out of business. But those were mail order catalogs that you could actually, through mail and through sending away, a check or a money order, could actually get all the goods that used to be made and then reused and repurposed on the farm. Okay, so you're going to have women moving to the cities, and there's a famous story that sometimes has come up on the AP test called Sister Carrie, about a farm girl who comes from Wisconsin to Chicago and is met with all the sort of dangers lurking. Now, when we think about who the new immigrants are, we want to compare it obviously to the old immigrants. So the first group of immigrants that came were obviously the British. And then in the 1840s and 1850s, we're going to see the Irish and the Germans more on the East Coast, although the Germans come to the Midwest. And we're going to see Chinese on the West Coast. But the new group that's going to come, sort of this second major wave of immigration, are going to tend to be, as I said before, from southern to some extent, sort of Eastern, Central, and Eastern Europe. So you're going to see groups that tend to look different. They tend to look swarthier. It's tougher for them to master the English language, and they tend to be of different religions overall. So you're going to have Eastern Orthodox, you're going to have Jews, which are of course different than the Protestants that had come earlier, or even the Catholics that are coming in the 1840s and 18. Okay, so when we look at this group, we want to realize that the people that came earlier, obviously not the Chinese and not the Irish, tended to be at least moderately prosperous and educated, and were able to come out to the Midwest and start their lives without sort of needing to rely on anyone else to help them get jobs. Now, most of the new immigrants, much like the Irish before them, lacked money to actually go anywhere, and so they tend like the Irish were as well. Now, they take unskilled jobs in factories, doing menial work, much as the Irish had done before. And then you can look that very high number of immigrants are going to be in sort of your major cities, albeit the East Coast or even here in the West Coast as well. But there doesn't tend to be any one group that dominates like we saw with the Irish or the Germans previously. Now, just as we saw with the Know Nothings way back in the middle of the 19th century, we're going to have a group that rises up, a group of nativists that is going to reject these foreign hordes that are coming in. Now, the group that we are going to remember most is the Immigration Restriction League. And the Immigration Restriction League was sort of the second of these two. And, like the Know Nothings before them, they're pushing these ideas that immigrants are dangerous and need to be checked out. And so, they're pushing this immigrants should be screened, that they should use literacy tests, which was incidentally something that was being used to keep African Americans from voting in the South at the time. So as you look at this political cartoon, you can see Uncle Sam keeping this sort of dirty, drinking, socialist vagabond from the gates of the United States, which is, as we'll see on this, very ironic. This is a famous political cartoon that's addressing the idea that if you look at these sort of healthy, dare I say, fat and corpulent, but well dressed and obviously successful men, keeping an immigrant from coming ashore, you can look and see that at one point these men were likely immigrants themselves before they became wealthy, or perhaps their family members are immigrants. So the great irony here that people who had once come and perhaps had been welcomed were now rejecting those that had come. Now, you could also look at it as perhaps these people had once been the person coming across this plank on the boat and that they hadn't been welcomed and that they're treating people just as they'd been treated. But generally speaking, I think the first interpretation. Now, this particular political cartoon, brought to us by our good friend Thomas Nast, has an interesting anti-Irish element. Now, you'll of course remember Thomas Nast from that remarkable political cartoon where you've got the Irish coming over, and you can see that the bishops' hats are actually crocodiles, and it was very much anti-Catholic and anti-Irish. Well, right here, you tend to see the Irish as well, usually as drawn by Nast as being very simian or very ape-like. So what you have here is Lady Liberty Columbia protecting a Chinese man with a bunch of really awful sentiments about the Chinese that are written on the wall behind him and her. And the idea here is that the Irish are particularly anti-Chinese. In many ways, if you think about what the reason that Irish had been anti-African American was sort of this fight for the bottom, that somebody could somehow come and surpass the Irish and leave them at the bottom. And one of those ideas that was really present was that Chinese men, and most of the immigrants that came over from China, were willing to do any sort of work, oftentimes even work that was described as female work. And so they were looked down upon in that regard. Now, this political cartoon obviously shows sympathy to the Chinese and really critical of the way they're being treated. Now, on this next cartoon, it's very interesting. Sort of this idea of what shall we do with our boys, which is the caption at the bottom. And if you're looking here, this is a derogatory picture of someone who's Chinese. It's got, the long braid sort of accentuating the long hair. It does that. If you look at the facial features, looks almost evil, a little bit animal-like. Again, trying to criticize the Chinese. Now, what's interesting here is it shows that this particular Chinese male can do so many jobs. Looks like almost like Doc Ock from Spider-Man. Has so many arms and is able to be so efficient and productive. And what's interesting is you'd think that this is almost being positive. Like, look how industrious this particular immigrant is. But what they're saying is that it's actually putting white Americans out of a job. And so as you see on the right side, you're seeing young men, and one of whom who's being sort of led off by the police saying, look, we're being pushed out of our jobs, and as a result, we ought to do something about the Chinese because they're taking all of our jobs. Now, Dennis Kearney, who's the president of the Working Party, almost not as big as the Know Nothing Party had been, but I want you to think of it almost as Know Nothing Party Part 2. And now what he's going to say and what his party, and this is really in California where you're seeing the most Chinese, is he's deriding the Chinese for being of a low form, and again for being willing to effectively work as slaves, as he calls them. Now he's going to criticize the way they dress, he's going to criticize what they eat, he's going to criticize how they live with a ton of people together. He's saying that they come over as men, they have no wives, they're effectively come over by companies. Again, he's sort of drawing on this image of slavery. And what he's going to say, much sort of as the Free Soil Party made the claim way back in the late 1840s and 1850s, is what does this do for the white male? It puts him out of a job because the Chinese are willing to work for such meager wages, and what employer actually wouldn't go for that? So, in this whole idea, if you're even thinking about what could be done, this leads, of course, to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which is renewed in 1892 and again in 1902, which is going to effectively prohibit Chinese immigrants from coming at all. Now, whereas we've seen efforts to limit immigration in the past, this is the very first time the U.S. government has passed a law specifically targeting one immigrant group.